Arthshila is a universal platform for creating and sharing ideas centered around the arts. An initiative of Arthshila Educational Society, Arthshila focuses on architecture, cinema, design, literature, performing arts, and visual arts across four locations: Ahmedabad, Shantiniketan, Patna, and New Delhi. And Arthshila Ahmedabad's focus lies in the fields of architecture, design, and visual culture. Stationed as a knowledge hub with access to multiple resources, the space hosts a collection of books, films, periodicals, and educational content on the third and fourth floor. Today morning, we inaugurated the exhibition Vandalizing the Indian Atelier, a search for stories of women practitioners, with an opening note by contributing practitioners, followed by exhibition walkthrough by Ishita of Curating for Culture. Curating for Culture work on a variety of projects across geographical boundaries and diverse community groups, constantly striving to create a transdisciplinary practice. Under the aegis of this collective, they have been engaged in research initiatives, facilitating learning experiences, and curating dissemination projects with a wide variety of collaborators. I would now like to invite Fiona from the team of Curating for Culture for further proceedings. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you all for joining us today. We welcome all of you to the first open dialogue of the exhibition Vandalizing the Indian Atelier. We have, through this journey of collecting the archives of women architects, experienced the shape-shifting nature of their practices. The women practitioners are constantly juggling between the personal and their professional lives. And this aspect becomes quite evident in their stories as well. So we have tried to capture the same through the exhibition as well. So the exhibition is curated as a scavenger hunt for the lost stories in the design field, in the voice of the women architects. We invite everyone to participate, contribute, and also add to the archives if you know any women that haven't been credited for their work. We would like you to write their names on the wall also. And without further ado, I'd like to call our curator, Ishita Shah, to...
Do I have to say something? Okay, I didn't know I had to say something, sorry. Okay, I'll just say thank you all for being here. I'll maybe repeat what I said in the morning. I don't have anything profound yet. The exhibition is, as we say, is usually an impression of the curator's mind, and what you see down there, a scavenger hunt or a scattered space or a vandalized atelier, is how I feel over the 3 years of this project, because we are still collecting these stories. We've not even scratched the surface. There's so much to do and then make sense of it. So we invite you to sort of make sense of these stories with us. And more than the research thought, I think I have more gratitude to share that this project has finally happened. I think the seed was sown 10 years ago, roughly. 3 years ago, we got the first grant from Grant Foundation. Then followed an amazing team who has had the vibe and the energy to continue working with this very small amount of grant that we all have. And then here is Arthshila supporting us, inviting us to sort of launch the archive with an exhibition. Keeps us motivated to do, I think, a little difficult project. I'm not trying to self-validate, but these projects are really difficult, and you would understand once you engage with the histories. So with that, we're very happy that we have now made this leap with finding more personal archives of the women practitioners. And with all of you along, we'll see where we can take it forward. Back to you, Fiona. Thank you.
So until recently, we know that practicing architectural research and history was not considered a legitimate practice. So, but today we see that many women are practicing architectural research and delving into history discourses. So, our first speaker is an architect and historian, Her work focuses on the built environment and how people use it, how they transform it, and how they inhabit it. She is also a wonderful teacher, and I can vouch for that as a student. I'm very proud and happy to welcome architect Gauri Bharat to present her work.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you all. It's nice to see familiar and unfamiliar people. Apologies to those familiar, you'll see stuff that you hope you already heard. So anyways, yeah. So like you said, I'm a teacher primarily. I also do research. I say that because I don't mind living as a teacher. Research I do for the pleasure and the intellectual stimulation that it provides. I don't think anybody makes a living as a researcher. It's important to maintain that distinction because it determines what we can and cannot do. It also determines why this is such a narrow field. But then we talk about more interesting stuff. So what I'm going to share very briefly is, and it's quite esoteric, fragments of work. I've been teaching now for 15 years and doing research off and on, more on than off. So I'll share, it's genuinely fragments because I was thinking, what do I present for 15 minutes which talks about what research I do? So anyways, I'll start with, when I started teaching, I used to teach these courses called humanities. And it was an interesting set of courses. It was meant to allow architecture students to understand the world. So what does it mean? I mean, how do we make sense of the world is what the lovely curriculum prefect said was. And so having trained as an architect myself, it was what my students and I worked on was heavily based on field work. So I'm sharing one example. We did a range of things, but I'll share one example, which was to map animals in Ahmedabad. Okay? So there are, why do we have cows on our street? Is sort of the question that we started with, right? Those of you who read the Ahmedabad Mirror, I hope you don't, by the way. But if you do, you will see very often that they have reports saying stray cow menace, and it sort of reached the last session of the government. It was sort of really big stray cattle menace, stuff like that. The central thing that, so when the students started looking at this, we were trying to understand, how does the city function? What keeps the city going? And so the students had a very simple task. They had to find an animal, they had to adopt an animal, not really adopt, but notionally adopt for the semester, and they had to follow it for a Saturday and a Sunday. And different people worked with different animals. This is a horse. So somebody had cows, somebody had horses, camels, donkeys, elephants, a whole range of animals. And it was quite weird and quite fun. They had to find out, so what is the daily life cycle of an animal? If an animal falls sick, what happens? Who looks after? How much does it cost to keep a cow in Ahmedabad? Some key things that they found was that most of these animals are not strays. You can't have 20,000 strays in a city. Something seriously wrong. These are not strays. These are privately owned animals. Traditionally, in most, not just Indian, most traditional agricultural societies, if you have a herd of animals, you don't feed the animals yourself. You send them out to graze. So the streets of Ahmedabad are really the equivalent of grazing commons. So they are out in the streets just like in a village, they'd be out in grazing commons. So what the students found was that many of the cows, mostly cows, are actually surviving off the streets of Ahmedabad as if it were a commons kind of a space. They also mapped out a whole bunch of other relationships. There are specialized markets that make carts that get hitched onto the backs of camels. There is an animal hospital. There are animal graveyards all over Ahmedabad. In other words, what we found once we started inquiring into this systematically, they found that there's an entire ecosystem of institutions, of people, of informal practices that are actually supporting the animals. I did this again a few years later. We thought, okay, let's try this out. Is this consistent all over Ahmedabad? So then she was a postgraduate student. She did a comparative study, Old City of Ahmedabad, New City of Ahmedabad, and beyond SG Highway. So what is the difference between the movement of animals across these three sites? At one level, very similar, in the sense that in all these places, there are people who are feeding the animals, animals. It's part grazing, part sustenance. But in each case, there is an ecosystem which is supporting the presence of animals in the city. We found similar things for camels, similar things for donkeys, although donkeys are fast disappearing. Donkeys are primarily used in the construction industry for mining sand. They could walk up the banks of the Sabarmati because that's where the sand was mined from. But once the banks started getting built up, then, and in any case now there are little trucks. So donkeys have gone out of use. So we found very interesting correlations between shifts in practices and the ecosystems that sustain animals in the city. I continue to do some work on streets. Along with students, we mapped roadside shrines. In fact, Aman assisted me once. One group of students mapped how is the city clean, who throws garbage where, and what are the thresholds of personal space. Our basic point was personal space is that you keep clean. And the moment you throw garbage, that marks the threshold. Where you throw garbage, you don't consider that your own space. So we had a class of 80 students who mapped out large stretches of Ahmedabad to try and get a sense of territoriality and territoriality, ownership, citizenship, notions of cleanliness. I started with this largely because this is sort of what my research journey was like, initially like. It was triggered by curiosity about how do things happen. How is the built environment formally structured, informally structured? But this eventually translated into more systematic ways of examining the built environment itself, as in not just as a setting for inhabitation, but also as a place that is actively produced. The other thing that I did a lot of work on, and this is the lovely photographs bit of the slide. So I did a lot of work on Adivasi villages. My PhD was on that, my undergraduate thesis was on that. I did a book on that in 2019. So I've been documenting Adivasi villages in Jharkhand. So the community, there are 40 different communities. The community that I was very interested in, again as an architect, this was in 2001. See, finally, architecture student, I was fascinated by the community that makes the most beautiful houses, which in this case was Santals. Santals, I'm calling them a community, they're not like Chota, they're like over 15 to 20 billion Santals all over India. So we're talking about 3 Ahmedabads full of Santals, so it's a large community spread over eastern India, Nepal, Assam, Bangladesh, Andamans. It's a large community. Anyways, the area of South Jharkhand where I was studying the transformation of Santals, one of the things that was very interested in, that I got very interested in was the mural art. They are renowned for the precision with which they craft their houses. These are done, this is copper construction, it's just done in mud and it's repainted every year. The artwork, I don't need to say, is quite exceptional. In fact, the image on the far end, it almost looks like a lovely wrapping paper that you could buy from Marks and Spencer or some really posh Fab India or something like that, like a 400 rupee. It looks like that. It's not something that you would associate with tribal art. Now, the women who were painting this it changes every year. They would do, so there are some areas where you just see geometric shapes. Other places where the women didn't have time or they were busy with housework, they would just paint horizontal bands of color. But those who have additional help in the house, in the agricultural fields, they would spend time doing this kind of artwork. What was really interesting was the sources of inspiration, because we tend to think of indigenous societies, we tend to think of all traditional cultures as being very static, as being unchanging over time. What was very clear here was that this inspiration, these images were coming out of stuff that the women had seen on television. There was no local reference for something like this. None of the other communities were doing this. So this is stuff that they had seen on television, they had seen on the nylon printed saris, on plastic sheets. Those were the sources of inspiration for this kind of work. The fact that their sources of inspiration were diverse and not always aesthetically nice, for want of a better word, this image, I mean, this was the sort of striking point that women aren't thinking about making something beautiful. They are really doing something that they want to do. if you notice the colors that are on the left-hand side image, you can see a sort of dirty green and a geru colored thing. So actually, in this particular village, the government had supplied resources to build toilets. Okay, and the two paints that the villagers have been supplying was this rust color and this green color. So that particular season, with the leftover paint, all the women had gone and painted the walls. I'm saying women because only women paint the walls. You would think that after so long the men would have done. They adamantly refused to, and they insisted that no, only the women know how to paint and men don't know how to do it. It's a fairly convenient excuse, as many of the women in the audience will recognize. But this is, so it was also very interesting that this was improvisational. It was not just this sort of pure tradition. And as architects, we're very fond of talking about identity and history and essence of things. These women were like, I have paint left over from making a toilet, I'm going to use it. And next to that, you can see a really ugly teddy bear. Okay, it's an ugly teddy bear. There was a dinosaur next to this. Okay, now this is not nice, but that woman was like, I want to paint a teddy bear this year, so I'm going to paint a teddy bear this year. And she was like, look, paint a teddy bear. Okay, not the nicest thing, but I think the point was what really struck me, the big unlearning here was that not all built environment choices come out of deep aesthetic commitment. Some of them can be for fun, and that's all right. It's not good. Eventually, yes. If this continues to happen, there is going to be a decline in a sense. But if the women feel empowered to do things that they recognize as the latest fashions of the time, if the empowerment is linked to doing this instead of the traditional whatever it was doing, there may be something in it. So a large part of this project, I haven't done any serious work on Adivasi history for about 4 years now, but a major learning from that project was acknowledging that people make choices in complicated ways. It is very often not possible to label, trace, codify choices of entire communities. And indigenous communities, traditional communities are as prone to fashion. And so much of the built environment emerges out of accidental, improvisational kind of decisions that when we are determined to find order in some of these things against the grain. Order doesn't exist necessarily. Or if it does, we have to privilege that it will be a kind of order that we may not necessarily process. So with this background of, I worked on this for about 10 years, so this background of sort of working with why do Adivasi people build the way they do. In 2019, I started another project which was on a history of reinforced concrete in India. It's a bit of a jump, but it had its own kind of birth, it had its own journey. But anyways, I teach architectural history, so obviously one of the key things that I was always talking about was I teach a third year course, so it is sort of 20th century, modern architecture, blah, blah, blah. And my postgraduate students, batches like Fiona's, they've done a lot of field work as well. So we started looking at, okay, what does it mean to actually make a building? So when the postgraduate program started, we started a specialized postgraduate program in 2014 in architectural history. It was specialization and then it became a program in 2018. So we follow a studio mode where the students are working on a problem and they are engaging with the problem in order to, in this case, not design, but to be able to arrive at a proposition. So one of the first studio problems that we dealt with was that what does it mean to design? So when we say that an architect is designing something, what is he or she or they, what are they doing? Are they producing form? Are they putting materials together? Are they putting spaces together? Are they creating layouts? One easy answer is they are doing all of this. But we know in reality that a lot of practices are not doing all of this. A lot of practices use plans that they have used for any number of buildings. A lot of architects design the plan, but then somebody else comes and does the facade. A lot of architects design the plan, but then the client goes away and then gets the thing drafted by somebody else. So these are all very. I've had a nominal. I've had a ringside view of practice, and I've done a little bit, very very tiny bit, but it was enough to tell me that the space of practice is messy, right? The cleanliness and the sort of ideological, moral high ground that we see in architectural history narratives doesn't exist. So one of the buildings I talk about in my history class is Nice's New National Gallery in Berlin. It's a fantastic building. It's this absolutely clean, pristine, modernist icon. The backstory is that Nice had designed it for the Bacardi rum people. They didn't want to do it, so when Berlin invited him, he said, okay, here, I have a plan. So even someone like Nice was circulating in improvising ideas. But this whole idea of the architect as improvising, the architect as adjusting, is not something that we find in any narrative. We think of a successful architect as somebody who has an imagined complete control over the project, which is a myth. And it has to be one of the most bizarre, pervasive myths of the 20th century. We can't figure out, everybody knows that no building gets built like that. And yet, we all pretend as if buildings get built cleanly. So anyways, so it was starting with that. So we started looking at stuff. So students had to go on site, they had to interview architects, they had to interview clients, and they had to find out what did the architect want to do, what did the client want to do, what did the building contractor do, did the neighbors complain, and they found all sorts of stories about the extremely iterative, complicated, circuitous routes through which buildings are actually getting made. What emerged from that is a stronger sense of what architects do. So it wasn't a dilution of architects as just doing pretty things, but it is in the process of this discovery, they find that architects add so much value. It's just a kind of value that we don't recognize. We think of architects as somebody who designs this perfect thing. No, the architect is somebody who's managing all these negotiations. So anyways, that started with, then it started extending to concrete buildings. We started with, okay, so when was the first concrete building made? The general answer, if I asked you all, so when do you think the first concrete building was made? Any guesses? Sorry, 1950? Yeah, that's your fairly sort of median range, that's the typical answer. Never mind, let me not put you in a spot. I'm supposed to speak, not you. So the typical answer I got was 1950. Some people would be like, no, Golconda House, Pondicherry, 1930s, This is the bad answer I'm going to give you is that we have to ask ourselves, what is a concrete building? Golconda House is the first building that uses concrete entirely, but that is where the project started. Finally, I'm at 1860, where the first sort of Portland cement blocks were cast, 1902, where the first reinforced concrete bridge was built. So it went back some time. In the middle of all that, so I'll just show one example and I'll stop with that. So this is, so basically in the project it's been now four years. I've looked at sort of hundreds of examples, all sorts of really bizarre examples. This one is not so bizarre. Actually, I lived very close to this for many, many years. This is in Jamshedpur. And what you're seeing at the far end, so this is the general office of the Tata Iron Steel Company. So this is one of the examples that, that's what the building looks like today. Of course, that's a photograph from 1920 or something, but it looks like that today. Heavily barricaded, you can't go in, Tata Steel office. Very ordinary looking. What was very interesting is the Tata Steel Archive very kindly shared some archival photographs of its construction. Between 1917 and 1920, the Tata Iron Steel Company documented the construction of the entire city. So every 3 months they would send a photographer who would photograph everything in the city, from roads being constructed to sewage lines to buildings, everything. And there, this photograph, this one, this is the structure of this is the general office under construction, and you can see that it's a steel frame structure, right? So I started digging a little more. Turns out that it was a steel frame structure designed by a firm in New York called Hunt and Hunt. It was supposed to be a 7-story structure, 7-story steel frame structure it was designed in 1917. So 1919, we are talking, I've been looking, I haven't yet, I can't confidently say, but it would have been arguably amongst the early high-rise buildings in India. So it was just like a thing that, wow, okay, how does something like this happen? And there are many such stories that have unfolded from asking the specific question about how a building is made. Rather than taking the complete building for granted, rather than taking what the architect says about the building entirely for granted, asking, okay, what did the architect have to do in order to get this building made? What are the things, what are the unexpected things that happen? And it is in that process that a whole bunch of other stories have uncovered. A lot of what my students do, I think, is in the same space. At least we encourage them to do that. A lot of my work is in that space. And I think the project that Ishita has curated, the moment you put women architects, they're bound to be talking about. I noticed Madhvi Desai's quote below. Madhvi, that was my first research job. I was her research assistant on the first book she did called Gender and the Built Environment. And one of the things that was constantly at play was the entanglement of domesticity and professional life. There were constantly things that were going on, bills to be paid, old parents to be looked after. Men architects, obviously, they don't talk about it. They do some of it. I'm not saying they don't. So I think this whole idea of the circumstantial, the improvisational is so central to how we live our lives. And a lot of my research is in that direction. I think this exhibition is in that direction. And I hope we embrace this messiness as a more real way of looking at the built environment. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am, for a very interesting presentation. So next we are privileged to invite designer and design historian Nia Thandapani, whose work focuses on post-independent design in India and the UK. She is also a co-founder of Chandigarh Chairs, a long-term project that works towards a critical evaluation of the history of modernist furniture in Chandigarh. Her creative work includes artist books, alternative museum guidelines, exhibitions and installations, and experimental designs. Welcome.
So I'm going to try and switch between reading over here and flipping over here, so just bear with me. So yeah, my name is Nia Thandapani. I'm a designer, design historian, and based in Bangalore. And I did, just for context, I did my undergrad in London in graphic design. I spent my whole design career working in India. I returned to London for a year to study design history at a course run between the RCA and the V&A. And the V&A is an institution that kind of emerged from what's called the Department of Science and Art that played a really decisive role in colonial design and education in India. And I'd be really happy to get into a friendly conversation about the sort of problematics of that decision. It certainly made me question why I had studied, but the context is that I come from a sort of a kind of formal design history training, and that comes with its own direction. So yeah, my design history work straddles the history of Tamil children's books and childhood on the one hand, and modernist furniture from Chandigarh on the other. And a link that I find between the two is the sort of larger question of design history. So how do we do it? Who is it for? Why did we bother? How do these two things, how do Tamil children's books and Chandigarh's modernist furniture design sit in the same space, share methodologies, perhaps speak to each other? So that's one of the things that I'm sort of interested in. But today I'm going to talk specifically about the Chandigarh Chairs project and how it connects to those kind of larger ideas around design history. And this is a project to make up 1/3 of the team with Petra Seitz and Gregor Wittrick, who are both based in London. And I'm going to kind of provide a bit of an overview of the direction that the project's taken and try to sort of raise a couple of the big questions for us and the sort of challenges that the project has unearthed for us as historians. And so let's see how much I can get through. So a little bit of context is needed. I'm sure some of this will be really familiar for a lot of you, but it's going to be just a really quick potted history of Chandigarh if I can. So as you will no doubt be aware, Chandigarh was built to serve as the new capital of the Indian Punjab after partition. Ultimately, the city plan was designed by the sort of doyen of modernist architecture, Le Corbusier, with the implementation of this plan and most of the other buildings, the large majority of buildings in Chandigarh, were left to a team of Indian architects working with and under Swiss-French architect Pierre Jeanneret, and a couple of British architects as well. And I'm kind of intentionally here not going through the whole list of names, which would never be comprehensive, because it is a very long list of names, and I think that that's very important to remember. I will mention, though, just in the context of the exhibition downstairs, this terrific looking woman, Yuli Mila Chowdhury, who I wish I was able to sort of tell you more about, but I think work is being done. I'm sure work has been done that I have been able to access on her practice, although I think she's a bit of a elusive figure as well from what I've heard. But she was one of the core team members on the early Chandigarh project and ultimately became chief architect of both Haryana and Punjab. So back to the furniture. As well as designing the buildings, this team of architects designed the furniture that was going to be used within these spaces, and that was for sort of financial reasons. The sort of buying large amounts of furniture was just prohibitively expensive. They designed a huge volume of furniture, from chairs to daybeds, children's school furniture, library shelving, private furniture, public furniture. It goes on and on. You can see in this image a couple of things. So sort of experimental furniture there on the left, daybeds that borrowed from the kind of form of the charpoy, library shelving, library desks, cinema furniture, you name it, they designed it. The furniture was then mass manufactured in Chandigarh and surrounding areas. And we also have seen this furniture kind of within Chandigarh. We've seen it in Delhi. We have recently heard about some of the furniture in Shimla. So it's got a kind of interesting spread in terms of its design and production. Just realized this is here. I can use this. Okay, so not insignificantly then, this furniture was then used for several decades in all of these spaces that it was designed for. I'll come back to that very short description, but I'll just leave that with you. It was used for several decades. Fast forward to the late 90s, and much of this kind of municipal furniture was inching towards sort of 50 years of use at this point, and so unsurprisingly, it was breaking down, it was being taken out of use, replaced with newer furniture. It was being stored, it was being resold at auction. So anybody that's kind of familiar with the way that the decommission of wooden furniture happens, it often happens through these sort of auctions, and either the auctioning of buildings or the assets within the building. So that's what was happening with this furniture that had been taken out of use. So at this point, kind of enter French antiques dealers. There's two at this point called Eric Touchelon and Gérald Moreau. And they began purchasing a large, unknown quantity of this furniture, but it's certainly a large amount, at these kind of government auctions. And they will claim that they purchased it for a very good price, but it was pretty low given what has happened, which I'll sort of get to in a minute. They then removed this furniture. I should say, we believe it was very low. We actually don't have these figures, and that's kind of part of what is difficult about this, problematic. So they removed this furniture to Europe, this large unknown volume of furniture. They removed it to Europe, they renovated it, they then started exhibiting it, and they ultimately began selling these pieces at auction. And this is really where a more kind of recent history of Chandigarh's furniture and its sort of international fame and vastly increased financial value on kind of global art market. This is where this begins. And it was sold on this global art market under the pretext that this was furniture designed pretty much exclusively by Pierre Jeanneret, the Swiss-French architect, who's actually a cousin of Corbusier that was brought in to be the sort of person on the ground. And so that's one part of the narrative, is that it's exclusively designed by Jeanneret, and the other part of the narrative that we are sort of generally told is that it was underappreciated in Chandigarh in the 1990s, and that's why it was being sold, and it was in need of saving from Chandigarh. So here you can, here you get a sense of the kind of what I'll call the narrative, and I'll come back to you, but the kind of things that get sort of said about the furniture. One is the idea that this is Pierre Jeanneret furniture. It's often referred to as Jeanneret furniture. If you do a Google search, all you'll get is the V-leg chair. But then there's this other part of the story that we're told, which is that the city didn't appreciate this furniture, didn't appreciate its own heritage, and that's sort of something that's been really reinforced over the last sort of 2 decades around this furniture. And whoops, sorry. Just going to go to the next slide and then try and find my place. So this, what you can see here is a recent auction of furniture from I think about a month or 2 back. And so I don't know how clear it is from the sort of scale of the screen, but you can see that everything is labeled as being designed by the architect Pierre Jeanneret. There's one at the bottom which I think has Corbusier's name as well for some reason. And these pieces of furniture at this point have reached prices in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. That was a library table, I think, that reached the highest amount. They are especially coveted design objects for the rich and famous around the world. So in a nutshell, sorry, I'll just go back for a second, it's distracting. But in a nutshell, what we argue within our project is that the narrative of Jeanneret, the basis upon which this furniture has been sold, is largely inaccurate, and it's biased, and it is so because it serves the international art market and its players. That is, this narrative around Jeanneret, this Swiss-French architect, closely connected to Le Corbusier, that this is a very lucrative narrative of this furniture, and it makes people in the art world quite a lot of money if that's the narrative that is sold around this furniture. And the sort of result of this narrative is this kind of narrative of Jeanneret design furniture being underappreciated in Chandigarh. It's kind of erased a history not only of the contribution of the Indian team, but also a kind of fuller and more accurate history of mass manufacture, use, and context of Chandigarh. And I'm really struck by this idea of kind of the messiness of architectural practice, and this idea that there's a space, there's an architectural studio space that these activities were happening in within Chandigarh, and the idea that only Jeanneret ever touched the designs of this furniture, it seems very, very unlikely, and I think there's evidence that points towards it is highly inaccurate. Actually, evidence through Riddhi Shah, who claims to have designed some of the pieces. So, I'm not going to go into kind of great detail about the project today. kind of why we believe that this is the case and our work, I'm just going to kind of point you towards some of our work, which is publicly available online if you want to get a kind of deeper sense of our argument and what our sort of evidence base is. I know some of these sound like big claims to be sort of arguing against this narrative that's now very, very set in stone. But yeah, I would sort of point you towards some of our work, but instead I just want to focus today on a kind of broader process and purpose of the work that we're doing and the kind of challenges I think it represents for design and perhaps architectural history as well. So if I pull back a bit from Chandigarh, the larger point of the work that we are doing at this point has really become about design on the art markets and what is happening when we see pieces of mass manufactured design pulled into the world of fine arts and antiquities. And so for us, this has been about kind of tracking and engaging with this process of narrative creation that's happened around the furniture for the art markets and the kind of ethical issues that this also raises. So in essence, this project has really kind of become about historiographical work. So when I joined my history of design masters, I had no idea what historiography was. I thought it sounded terribly boring, not at all what I had gone to do the design history masters for. I thought I was going to be trained to sort of unearth these fascinating stories about design objects, but it turns out that the kind of history of history, the theory and history of history, which is what sort of historiography is on one level, has kind of become this really huge and fascinating part of this project and also how I now approach design history. In the context of Chandigarh, it's really become about questioning received notions and assumptions about histories that we think we know and that we're being told. And I think this is where the kind of importance of solid, good historical work comes into the fore for architectural and design history. I think we really do need to be kind of asking questions and challenging who is writing these histories and what sort of agendas and biases they have and that they're bringing to this endeavor. So in the case of Chandigarh, for example, the core literature on Chandigarh's modernist furniture is written by foreign antiques dealers that have gone on to sell this furniture. So there's a sort of large tome of book that is unfortunately called the Indian Adventure, which is the core piece, the core text that is used in the bibliography for almost all the furniture that is sold. And this was written by the dealers who first came to India. Interestingly, it was even being used before it was published. So that idea is sort of the kind of narrative makers and the art world sort of being hand in hand becomes very clear when you start to see that it wasn't even published yet and it was already being used as a citation to sort of prove that this furniture was what it was and being used to sell the furniture. So the second part of this sort of project for us is about then contributing to the rewriting of these kind of embedded popular histories. And I kind of stress the words popular here because this isn't a project that can exist on a kind of purely academic or within a purely academic sphere because it plays out in a really public way. So it's very hard to actually open any, I mean, maybe we can see it upstairs, but it's very hard to open any issue of popular interior design magazines these days in India and internationally without seeing a piece of sort of quote unquote genre furniture. I keep noticing it in the sort of photo shoots of high street sort of premium shops like Nikbar and Safa, if you know. So these are brands that kind of want to associate themselves with this kind of high design value that these chairs come with. So And you can also see it in the likes of Riddhi Shah, who will advise you via Architectural Digest how to ensure that you're buying a so-called real piece of genre furniture. So really embedded in the kind of in the popular press around architecture and design. But they're also all over Instagram. I'm sure you've seen many of these. They are just everywhere at this point. So the narrative of Chandigarh chairs has kind of gone way beyond the scope of academic and professional spaces and plays out largely, as I said, within social media and the popular press and kind of art market focused publications. And in fact, actually, part of the historiographical work has been about showing that the knowledge and narratives around these chairs never really actually existed in academic spaces to begin with. It sort of started with the dealers and their work in Chandigarh, building up this tone that everybody then referred to. So this small number of kind of antiques dealers who stood to gain a very huge amount from their particular narrative of history. So with this in mind, for us, I think it's really important to be engaging with these non-academic spaces if we're to have any kind of hope of disturbing this narrative and kind of engaging with this narrative. So what are we doing and why is it needed? One of the things that we're doing is a large data collection exercise. So we've got, at the moment, more or less all of the publicly available auction data that we can get. Many of these auctions have sort of started in early 2000s, so a lot of this information is available. It's still on auction houses' websites. We've been able to collect over 1,000, I can't remember the exact figure, individual sort of data points, if you like. So pieces that are sold, collections of pieces that are sold. And this kind of shows us things like the way in which nationality is used. So you start to see the furniture popping up on French design sales or on Swiss design sales, and you start to see how the furniture gets connected to a European modernist canon, which already has a market and has a great value. We see things like, as I was saying, the fact that the dealer's book is the main source of citations in the auction records. We see things like the list, which is included within the dealer's book, all of the furniture that they found. The codes are used by almost all the auction houses. So I don't know how clear it is from here, that there'll be sort of PJ, a letter, a number, and that PJ obviously stands for Pierre Jean-Ray. And that's not used just uniformly as the way of referring to different models of this furniture, but it has nothing to do with the way that the furniture was referred to when it was first designed. It also has nothing to do with the way that the furniture is referred to by the Chandigarh government. This is kind of purely coming from a inventory that was created by the dealers. So there's a lot that we can kind of get from these auction records. But the other part of this for us is what we think of, what we've kind of come to think of as what a regenerative research practice might look like. So this data is all online. We share it when we update it. We put it on our website so that other people can use this data and draw from this data and work on this too. So secondly, we think that it's also really important to, as I said, engage with the spaces that are home to these kind of common narratives of the furniture. So things like social media, design magazines. So at the moment, you'll kind of find our work spread across things like academic writing, of course, and speaking, but also in kind of popular press and engaging with journalists who are writing about this furniture and trying to kind of talk to them about, how we might think about the sort of nuances of this narrative, giving presentations like this, and hopefully accessible ones that are for more than just design historians like ourselves, writing for online journals, and as Fiona mentioned, we work on a zine recently as well. So finally, the other aspect, I guess, for me, the other aspect that stands out for me that I think is important to point to with this project is a sort of defining feature for me has been about kind of self-questioning part of this research that we're doing as well. And kind of questioning ourselves internally, reevaluating our work and the process that we're sort of going through. And I think we're going to maybe talk about this a little bit more in the Q&A, but I think this is where the idea of some collaboration becomes really, really important from my point of view as a design researcher, historian. This kind of process that collaboration allows us, which is about pushing each other, questioning each other within a kind of collaborative practice, and then putting this work out. And I think my own thinking around design history is really owes a kind of depth to a kind of collaborative approach to this work. So I hope that this provides a bit of context to the project and the larger challenges that we think it kind of explores within design history, as well as a little bit of a glimpse at our own process and talking more about this and discussing some of the ideas that have been raised by the speakers in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. That was very insightful. Next, we'd like to call Riddhi Shah, an architect, researcher with a specialization in history and design. She has worked on several publications and research that range from architectural conservation, pedagogy, semiotics, and historiography. We welcome you.
Good evening, everyone. So I call this explorations, and I've been teaching at Rajkot since 2011, and I would like to talk about what I am learning with my students as well as what I'm doing today. So basically, So when we talk about history, we have lot of parallels. So putting it simply in a matrix, I say that there are certain physical features which range from regional to international. There are certain socio-political reasons, cultural reasons, material as well as unmaterial. And then we talk about technology, arts, architecture, and all the other things. So when I have to understand or when I have to talk about history of architecture, I have to try and make connections with all the other things that have led to an impact on the architecture. So when I teach architectural history, the major objective is to identify and critically assess the positions taken by the people across the time in order to achieve something. And by positions, I mean to say that there are certain situations which are given, and there are certain strategies which help to derive some solutions. So in the whole journey, I try and understand the situations which are there, which range from all the parallels that were mentioned in the first slide, and then we identify what are the strategies that the patrons, architects, or master builders would have had in order to build it. So from a journey from positions to identifying situation and strategy by which we understand it better. And in order to understand this position, the first thing we have to understand is the kind of situation that is existing. So as we all know that generally in each semester, especially in undergraduate architecture curriculum, the semester and the course is history of architecture course is with reference to the time period. So evolution is basic and then it is divided with reference to time. So I'm just taking an example of the semester wherein we teach modern and postmodern and contemporary architecture. So in order to understand the situation, we try and identify all these small things. So for example, if I say 1850 to 1950, 1750 to 1950, then we try and figure out what was happening in the domain of art, which includes painting, sculpture, film, everything. What were the technological innovations that were happening at that point in time? What were the governing structures or what was the socio-political condition of the place at that time, and then try and understand what kind of architecture emerged. So it's more about understanding the whys of a building rather than just understanding what the building is about. What is the spatial organization? How is it connected? What are the forms of it? So it's more about why rather than what is the building. And in order to understand that why, we try and make a sense of the whole world, because we understand things only if we are able to connect the dots. And it is really important for everyone to identify the dots to be able to make the connection. So if I have to make connections, I'll make it the way in which I understand things. Unless and until I know the dots, I won't be able to make logical connections or reasonable connections. So in order to make these connections in every semester and to understand the situation, we make these timelines. So without getting into any details of anything, I ask my students to try and put whatever was happening at that point in time. And then later we understand, we identify what buildings were made and why these buildings were made in this way. So this is a basic process by which they make timeline. So just giving one frame of time, they try to identify what was happening internationally, what was happening nationally, and what was happening regionally. So it is trying to build a matrix wherein they understand things parallelly. So, and this is how they try and make parallel narratives of what was happening at a particular time and why it was happening in the way in which it was happening. So, and while they are making this timeline, we do a lot of discussions. They try and understand why certain things would have happened in the way, and they start making the connections, and then they try and connect the dots. So this is a process from identifying the situation to going at the strategy. And the strategies are the buildings that we generally look at in a particular time. And then obviously we talk about how is the building made, what are the materials, and all the other things. But I think it is really important. So the first tool that I use to understand the strategy is making a timeline. This is how I understand history. And I think it really helps an individual to understand if they try and put everything on a table. And the second thing which helps me understand why it is like this is to put it on map. So I use these two tools, timeline and maps, to make the sense of world. And if one makes a sense of the world, then they'll be able to better understand it. So this is just an example of Art Deco buildings, which the students, like left hand side is the Art Deco buildings, and they are trying to look at what kind of buildings were made in the world, what was the time period, what kind of buildings were made in India, and what kind of buildings are there in Rajkot. So I come from Rajkot, which is a central place. It's a city in Saurashtra region of Gujarat. So, so national, international, national, and regional, and then we try and understand why nationally things happen certain way and why it is in Rajkot. And the second example is again about vernacular architecture exercise that we did, but it is the idea is same. Understand the situation, understand the building, and that is how you understand why of it. And this is how the overall timeline. It's a different kind of timeline, but every time we make this matrix after the students get the basic data. So that matrix is evolved after the data that they get. Okay. So basically, while doing all these things, we use certain innovative ways in which we can understand things more. So we read travelogues, we look at movies, we try and understand the place in a better way, and what was it the way in which it is. And so this method allows an individual to engage with the kind of data that they are looking at. So from passive learning to it goes to active learning. The process is free flowing. So a teacher does not tell that you have to look at this. It is the student who tries to make this connection that I want to understand it in this way. So it is rather than teacher telling something, it comes from the students and then we discuss it why things are like this. And that is how it makes the study meaningful for every individual. So rather than doing the study for the case of it has to be meaningful. And there are obviously certain challenges when we look at international, national, regional. We have to search for authentic data because in the context of regional histories, it's really difficult to get that authentic data, and the data is also in different vernacular languages. So it's important to understand that. And in the process, we try and so the datum is one is time and second is place. And for time, it is timeline, and for place, it is maps. So that's how we understand the world. Okay, so from here, when I say that when I'm looking at regional histories, it's really difficult for one to get authentic data. At that juncture, by regional, I'm just trying to talk about the place from where I am. So I don't talk about regional histories anywhere in the world. I talk about regional history of Saurashtra. And I am a graduate of a college which from the second batch, and we have related study programs, and we document places. And since last 10 years, we have documented a lot of architectural heritage of Saurashtra region, which is a part of Gujarat. So while I am teaching modern architecture in Gujarat, modern architecture in Rajkot, I come across certain Art Deco buildings. I come across certain buildings of colonial style, certain buildings Indo-Saracenic, certain buildings of different typology. So what we realized is that we at college have a lot of data which needs to be gelled into that bigger picture of architecture that we were showing. So, we in 2017 we had around 3,500 drawings, which majorly focuses on architecture of that region. And it was really important for the school to start archiving those drawings for the basic reason of preserving whatever we have done, because it is the only architecture college in the region and it has a huge amount of data which is specifically of a place. So we started archiving these drawings, and the broader vision was to give credentials to whoever has worked on this region. Because after working on this region or architecture of this region, we again go back to Le Corbusier, Louis Kahn, B. Does not make sense, because they have been working in their time in their place and with a lot of inferences from that place. So it's important to for one to ground their understanding into that place, and this archives helped understand that. So later what we did is we just plotted what all RSPs we had, related study programs we had in Saurashtra region, and then what we did is, so first is villages, second is towns, and third is institutions. So this is just an example of a matrix wherein we looked at what all cities in Saurashtra we have documented with reference to institutions. And we started collecting data and we started putting the plans in order. So to be able to understand, because I was parallelly teaching modern history, postmodern history, contemporary, my focus was more on institutions that came about from 1850 to 1950 or from 1800, something like that. So I started putting all the plans and looking at what kind of fabric is there. And later, so after 6 months, 8 months, I collected a lot of data which started making sense. It started making sense because I found certain typology of buildings existing at all the places, and I found out that there are a lot of histories which are written in Gujarati. Yes, the data is not in English, but there is a huge amount of data which is in local language, and probably it is taught in certain other disciplines, but not in architecture. So there are history departments which teach the history of a place, but architecture do not take clues from them. And I started making sense of it, and then we came up with an exhibition of all the related study programs that were done in our college third year. So last 10 years, and we had this exhibition on architectural heritage of Saurashtra, wherein we plotted all the elevations in one line and with reference to the tentative dates. So you remember the kind of matrix we were making with reference to dates, and I did that with the buildings of Saurashtra, and I started understanding the typology, the way in which things are. Understood the bigger picture of India, understood the bigger picture of how it was ruled by the British or the native princely states. So slowly, steadily, we started building up a lot of data which is about indigenous cultures. And then this was the exhibition. And currently what we are doing is we are trying to systematize all the collection that we have. So we have digitized around 4,500 drawings that we have, which is now accessible to the researchers and students on demand. So whenever anyone wants to study something about Saurashtra, we have RSPs of different places like Udaipur, Jaipur, Bidar, but our focus of the colleges in Saurashtra, and anyone who wants to do some research can come to the college and look at it. So basically categorizing and putting things together. And yes, now the researchers from other places have started using the archival data that is there in college. So there's a museum which is coming up in Rajkot by the princely family of Rajkot, and they have their archivists which are from different places, and now they're using the archives at our college. So it is this data which will help contextualize the history of the place, and it will start making meaning of what India was at the time of pre-independence and post-independence. So later, so these are certain benefits of these archives, and yes, there are a lot of challenges. In addition to these benefits, there are a lot of challenges because there are no fundings to preserve, protect this. There are no fundings for digitizing it, and every time someone has to fight for that funding because large number of people do not understand the importance of the documentation that is happening. Because I document something, but how would others understand the importance of it? And so that is always there. And we are struggling with it, but yes, one thing is sure that it has started slowly and steadily, it has started making an impact. So after that, when I did this compilation on architectural heritage of Saurashtra, it was like parallelly in India there is a firm called Drona, which was doing a project with Niti Aayog, Government of India, and they were trying to identify the challenges to the architectural heritage of India. And there was an open call wherein they asked people to collaborate on identifying the heritage of that place. And our school collaborated with Drona and said that we will give you a list of architectural heritage of Saurashtra because it is there somewhere lying in our libraries or somewhere in our reading materials. And I led that team and we came up with around 400 buildings in Saurashtra which are existing. Not in a very good condition, but yes, they are there and they are valuable. As a resource, they are valuable. As the kind of styles that emerged in that time, it is valuable. And so we came up with that 400 plus building list. So what next to it? So after we gave that list, it was just in the library. But there has to be some connection to what happens to that list. So what we identified is that so the buildings were not in good state. Something had to be done in urgency, and we took a lead and discussed with INTAC, Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage, which did not have a chapter in Rajkot. So there were a few chapters in Saurashtra as well as Gujarat, but Rajkot did not have a chapter, and it was essential to have that chapter in Rajkot because it was a geographical center, it was important historically, and today also it is important. So we established the intact chapter, and the jurisdiction was Rajkot district. So from that international thing that I showed, we came to Indian history. Later we came to history of Gujarat, we came to history of Saurashtra, and now we are talking about history of Rajkot. And we are taking that system that INTAC has established to systematically map and identify the condition of architectural heritage of Rajkot. And in that we do a lot of activities through which we have invited people to join us. Every individual, rather than just architects or just designers, everyone has a sense of belongingness to their place. And this is a model by which we are trying to connect with the people of Rajkot because they have a lot of stories to tell. And certain interesting initiatives that we did is to bring in more people there were two major initiatives which I would like to talk. One is Hug the Heritage. So every year, Valentine's Day, we talk about love between a girl and a boy. Last Valentine, we said that let's talk about our love for the heritage, the buildings and material culture that we have. And we invited people to share that love with us. So they could either send us a photograph of their heritage, which they find important, or some building which they associate with. And fortunately, we received some 200 plus entries. So it was Valentine's week, which stretched to Valentine's month. But in that month, we received 200 plus entries of people talking about their place. And we had said, you just have to talk about Rajkot district, nothing beyond it. So someone from US is sharing their love for their heritage in Rajkot. They are in US, but yes, they have some connections there. So these are the initiatives by which we are trying to do a formal listing of all the heritage, tangible as well as intangible. And fortunately, because of this, it caught the attention of a lot of media. So newspapers, everyone started noticing that there's something which is important and it's trying to bring in people. And everyone agreed that there has to be some method by which these structures or this heritage needs to be preserved. So yeah, these are certain clippings and certain snippets. And the second initiative we did was Chalo Chalaviye Charkha. So 100 years ago, when Gandhiji talked about Charkha as a model of Swavlamban, today we can't talk about Charkha being a model of Swavlamban. Today it has to be something else. It's important. So we portray Charkha being a model to achieve concentration. So in today's time, digital detox is essential, and everyone needs to find some way by which they could get rid of it. And that is when we said that let's try and bring in this charkha, which really helps us get concentration, which is also an interesting. So whenever there is Gandhi Jayanti or any event which is associated with Gandhiji, there is a charkha which is placed, and everyone clicks a picture near the charkha and does nothing about it. So we said that let's bring in Peti Charkha. So, and we identified a lot of families who had Charkha library. So they had a collection of 10 Peti Charkha and they used to rent it. So these are small ways by which we start getting connected with our place. So I'm getting connected with Rajkot, real place which is there, and I need to work there. And then this was also a real hit sort of thing because everyone was interested in really working with Charkha. And then parallelly we do these teachers training program. So the format is intact Delhi. And we try to understand the formal method and we do it at Rajkot level. So we are training the teachers of small towns, Gondal, Jodhpur, Jasdan, in Rajkot so that they try and bring this heritage education in their schools. And yes, we are doing formal documentation of all the buildings that have not been documented as of now, or when we get a news of some building getting torn out, we at least ask them to wait for a while. And if we can convince them, it's a win-win situation. If we cannot convince them, at least we document it. It will make an impact. Slowly, steadily, it will make an impact. And then we do this small activity, trying to revive the traditional art and craft, trying to bring in heritage education or knowledge about India into kids. We have this heritage quiz, we have these programs. And again, so while we had this heritage quiz, we came back again with this architectural heritage exhibition, architectural heritage of Saurashtra. So the first thing when we did, we just focused on architects or designers. Second time when we did, we brought this exhibition for school children and teachers, which is where I'm trying to, and these small activities, and we do all the activities at different places, the places which are not noticed, and yes, till date we are finding new buildings and trying to engage with the place, and yes, we have been able to collaborate with a lot of agencies, and so we want architectural heritage or our heritage to be discussed in all the houses so that we can make a difference, and these explorations continue. Thank you.